When the giant's body first washed up on the shore, it lay sprawled along the sand like some ancient god cast down from the sky. The tide had delivered it without ceremony. No storm, no procession of waves heralding its arrival. Just one morning, there it was. Limbs longer than lifeboats, skin pale as marble, salt-crusted and still. At first, people approached it cautiously, whispering in small groups, unsure whether it might rise again. The sheer scale of it provoked awe. Its head alone was the size of a cabin. One massive arm stretched outward toward the sea, as if it had reached too far, too late. The fingers curled slightly, their nails thick and cracked, yellowed like old ivory. Fish darted in pools that had formed between the toes. Gulls circled its belly. Soon the scientists came. They measured the limbs, sketched the ears, took samples of the skin. There were theories. Some speculated it had come from a distant island, a relic of some hidden race. Others claimed it was the product of mutation, a trick of evolution. But no one could explain the serene expression on its face. There was no fear, just stillness. Children climbed its knees. Lovers posed beside its shoulders. It became an exhibit, a conversation. The town filled with reporters and tourists. Along the boardwalk, vendors sold postcards with its image, labeled simply, "The Drowned Giant." The narrator, a biologist by trade, visited often, at first to observe, then just to sit. He would bring his notebook, sketching the angles of the ribs, the curve of the spine, the way seaweed tangled in the hair like a crown. Each visit felt quieter. The crowd grew less reverent. The mystery began to dull. Over the following weeks, the body began to change. The sun hardened the skin. It peeled in great sheets, revealing sinew and veins, dried to leather. The smell grew sour, then bitter. Birds pecked at the flesh. Dogs gathered near its feet. Graffiti appeared across the thighs, names, crude jokes, hearts carved with initials. The narrator recorded it all, noting how quickly wonder slipped into familiarity, then disregard. One day, he watched as a group of teenagers scaled the ribs and leapt from the shoulder blades into the shallows below, laughing. No one stopped them. No one watched with awe anymore. Then came the cuts. Chunks were taken. First a toe, then a portion of the thigh. Butchers arrived with saws. Art students collected teeth. A circus claimed the ears and carted them off in a truck. Someone carved a stairway into the side of the leg, leading to a platform where people could look out over the ocean. The narrator sat helpless. He thought to speak, but found no words that would restore the reverence. The body no longer inspired mythology. It was now material. It was now useful. The torso was hauled away by winches. The head disappeared one night. No one knew who had taken it. In its place was a divot in the sand, swirling with brackish water. Children played in it. Soon the bones emerged, writhed. Bleached and clean, the ribs stood like broken fence posts. Seaweed wrapped around them. Crabs made homes in the hollow sockets. The heart cavity was empty. And yet, even then, the body seemed to breathe. Not in motion, but in memory. The narrator stood one morning where the skull had rested, his feet buried in the cold sand. Around him, tourists wandered, uninterested. A few vendors remained, but the postcards had changed. Now they bore only a title, The Beach, with no image of the giant. He remembered the first moment, the way the sea had seemed to hush in its presence, that impossible stillness, that feeling of insignificance in the face of something so large, so unknowable. And now it was gone, eroded not by water, but by human touch. In time, stories changed. People began to doubt it had ever existed at all. Some claimed it had been a whale, exaggerated by gossip. Others called it a publicity stunt. The remains were scattered, misidentified. One museum displayed a femur labeled prehistoric sea mammal. A carnival had a molar in a glass box attributed to a sea monster. The narrator knew better. But even he began to question the scale in his memory. Had the giant truly been so large? Had its eyes really been closed in peace? Or was that his imagination, clouded now by nostalgia? All that was left was sand and silence. Yet sometimes late at night, when the tide curled low against the shore and the moon cast long shadows, he would hear something deep beneath the waves, a sound like breath, a presence not quite gone. And he would remember with aching clarity the first time he stood before the giant and felt very small. The remains of the giant, though reduced to fragments, lingered not only in the sand but in the quiet of the beach where it once lay. Even with the bones scavenged, reclassified, and sold off, a kind of echo remained, etched not into the earth but into those who had seen it. Into the narrator's mind, especially. He returned, as he always did, walking the coastline at dawn before the crowds arrived. The early light threw long, golden fingers across the sand, and he traced the edges of where the body had been, as though walking the outline of a dream. Seabirds skated the wind above him. The tide rolled in gentle, murmuring syllables. Sometimes he imagined the ground itself breathed. A year had passed. New visitors to the beach saw nothing more than sky and surf. They set up umbrellas and laughed and played in the shallows, unaware that they stood atop the memory of something once sublime. One morning, he met a boy collecting driftwood. They exchanged nods. The boy asked if he knew the story of the giant because his uncle had said something about it being real, but his mother called it nonsense. The narrator said nothing at first. Then he looked out at the sea and murmured, "He was real." The boy squinted, curious. "Was he a monster?" "No," the narrator replied. "Just large, quiet." The boy shrugged and wandered off. The narrator stayed, feeling the weight of that word, quiet, like an anchor on the tongue. The giant had made no sound, not once. Even in death, it had been utterly still. Later that week, the narrator wandered inland where the last fragments were said to remain. Behind an abandoned warehouse, he found what he believed was a section of rib planted upright in the ground like a post. Vines had begun to twist around it, obscuring the smooth curve. It was painted now, graffiti and initials layered thick across the surface. He touched it gently. The texture had changed, once skin, then bone, now monument, a relic of a forgotten thing. Not mythical, not sacred, just matter. The locals had moved on. The sea, ever indifferent, took no sides. It remembered nothing. It gave and took as it always had. The waves rolled on, erasing footprints, swallowing the edge of memory. Still, for the narrator, the presence of the giant became something internal. The image returned to him in dreams, not in terror, but in slow, silent reverie. He would see its face beneath the surface, just beneath, as though sleeping, the ocean covering it like a blanket. He would reach out, never quite touching it, before waking. These dreams became more frequent. One night, during a storm, he stood on the bluff above the beach and stared into the black waves. Lightning flashed. For a moment, perhaps illusion, he thought he saw movement far out at sea. A ripple, a ridge, the suggestion of something massive rising, then slipping back beneath the surface. He did not tell anyone. Instead, he began to write. Not a report, not a paper, but something more quiet. A record for himself, a way to hold what remained. He described the curve of the giant's foot, how each toe had its own texture. The underside of the heel, pocked with barnacles, the length of the femur, long enough to bridge a river. The way the ear had curled slightly inward like a shell. He remembered how children had once slid down the spine as though it were a playground, how tourists posed beside the torso, laughing, cameras clicking. He recorded how quickly reverence had become amusement, then utility, then trash. The decay, he wrote, was not just of the body, it was of imagination, the erosion of mystery by familiarity. He kept his pages in a drawer, unread. A decade passed. The beach changed shape. The tides shifted the dunes. The boardwalk crumbled and was rebuilt. New shops appeared, selling inflatable toys and caramel popcorn. The postcards had long since stopped printing the image of the giant. Now they featured sunsets and dolphins, abstract paintings of waves. Most people forgot. But the narrator, older now, slower, continued his walks. He limped slightly from a fall, but still he came. Each morning he would pass the same stone, the same bend in the beach where the giant's head had rested. He would pause, close his eyes. In his mind, the body still lay there, whole, untouched, a presence outside of time. It was only years later in an art gallery in a nearby town that he found another fragment. A massive toe bone mounted on a pedestal, described only as fossilized whale fragment, unknown origin. He stood before it for a long time, then left without speaking to the curator. The sea continued to offer up its dead, Driftwood, tangled nets, shells with holes worn through by time, but never again anything so vast, so utterly inexplicable. Still, he waited. He returned to the beach, year after year, tracing the old steps, the places where bones had once been, the shallow pool that had formed where the skull had vanished. Sometimes the sand felt warm beneath his feet, as though some dormant heat still pulsed below. He knew it was impossible. But he walked on anyway. The years passed, and with them, the edges of the memory frayed like cloth washed too many times. The narrator aged. His hair thinned, his joints stiffened, but the habit remained. Each morning, long before the sun rose, he walked the beach where the giant had once lain. The town no longer mentioned it. A few older residents might recall it if prompted, shaking their heads with vague amusement or disbelief. But the photographs had faded. The bones had vanished into museums, black markets, or buried under new concrete. The sea had closed its mouth, and yet, in the narrator's heart, the story refused to die. One evening, just after twilight, he wandered out farther than usual, following the tide's retreat. A thick mist rolled in from the sea, muffling the world, dimming the horizon until even the sky seemed to dissolve. The damp clung to his skin, but he didn't turn back. In the soft fog, he heard a distant splash, measured, not like waves. Something deeper. He paused. Then another splash, not threatening, not hurried, just slow, enormous. He walked closer to the sound, but the mist offered only silhouettes, rocks, seaweed, the faint line where water met shore. Then, as he squinted into the shifting gray, he saw what he knew couldn't be there, something vast rising slightly above the tide, not the giant, not in flesh, but the shape of him traced in water and light, a ripple where the chest had been, a gleam where the forehead might have shone, the sea remembering. The figure didn't move, but the silence around it deepened, as if the world was holding its breath. The narrator stepped forward, his feet sinking into the wet sand. There were no footprints in front of him, only his own. And in that moment, something broke open, not in the sea, but inside him. He remembered not just the giant, but the feeling of wonder, the breathlessness, that sensation of standing before something too vast to name, a mystery too sacred for explanation. He fell to his knees, the mist wrapped around him like a shroud. The water lapped at his fingers, he whispered into the wind, not knowing what he said, and then the shape dissolved, not vanished, dissolved, as if it had never been there or had always been there, a part of the tide. The sea resumed its rhythm, and the world exhaled. He sat for a long while. Eventually, he rose and returned home. In the following weeks, he wrote again. Not in pages he would hide in drawers, but in a thick leather-bound book he placed by the window. He wrote not just about the giant, but about what it meant to be forgotten, about what it meant to see something extraordinary and then live among the ordinary again. He wrote about reverence and time and the slowness of decay. He wrote about the sea. Not long after, the narrator died in his sleep. Peacefully, his neighbors said, the kind of death most would want. Quiet. His house was sold, his belongings sorted, most of his writings were discarded. But the leather-bound book remained. The new owner, a woman who taught art at the university, found it and brought it to the local library, thinking it might be of interest. It sat on a shelf, mostly unread, but sometimes someone would find it. Usually by accident, they'd flip through the pages, pause at the drawings of the giant's hand, the curve of his spine, the delicate rendering of his eye, and sometimes they would go to the beach, not searching, just walking. And once in a while, the sea would offer them silence so deep it hummed, the wind would still. And they would feel it, not see, not hear, but feel something vast just beneath the surface, breathing with the tide. And they would wonder, not with fear, but with awe. The same awe the narrator had carried all his life, like a secret too sacred to speak. A memory that the world would always